Welcome, and thank you for being here. Tonight, we are not stepping into a dramatic crime scene or a place of sudden change. Instead, we are moving slowly, almost quietly, into a part of history that existed in the background. This is a story about everyday life, about routines repeated day after day, and about places most visitors never noticed. As you listen, there is nothing you need to remember and nothing you need to solve. Just let the details pass gently, as we take a calm look at what everyday life was really like in the slum neighborhoods of Las Vegas during the 1970s. In the popular imagination, Las Vegas in the 1970s was a city of endless light. Neon signs glowed through the night, casino floors never seemed to sleep, and visitors arrived expecting excitement at every corner. The Strip, already famous by that decade, offered polished hotel lobbies, carefully controlled environments, and an illusion of constant celebration. For tourists, Las Vegas was a destination designed to feel separate from ordinary life. It was a place where time blurred, money moved quickly, and reality could be briefly ignored. Yet only a short distance away, often just a few minutes by car, a very different Las Vegas existed. Beyond the bright signs and carefully maintained sidewalks were neighborhoods that rarely appeared in postcards or advertisements. These areas were not hidden by distance but by attention. They existed in plain sight, yet remained largely invisible to those who came for entertainment. In the 1970s, many of these neighborhoods struggled with poverty, limited public investment, and aging infrastructure. The contrast between the polished image of the city and the quiet reality of these areas was striking, but it was rarely acknowledged. For residents of the slum neighborhoods, daily life did not revolve around spectacle. Mornings began early, often before sunrise, as people prepared for work. The air was dry, the streets still cool before the heat of the day settled in. Small homes, apartments, or trailers held entire families, sometimes multiple generations under one roof. Space was limited, privacy was rare, and routines were shaped by necessity rather than choice. People learned to move around one another, sharing kitchens, bathrooms, and common areas without much conversation. These neighborhoods were shaped by their location. Close enough to the casinos to provide labor, yet far enough away to remain overlooked. Many residents worked jobs connected to the tourist economy, though they rarely experienced its rewards. Cleaning rooms, maintaining buildings, preparing food, or handling laundry were common forms of employment. These jobs were physically demanding and often came with irregular hours. A shift might begin late at night or end early in the morning, leaving sleep schedules fragmented and days blurred together. Wages were modest, and financial stability was difficult to achieve. Rent, utilities, food, and transportation required careful planning. A missed shift or an unexpected expense could disrupt an entire household's balance. Because of this, everyday life in these neighborhoods revolved around caution. Purchases were considered carefully. Items were repaired rather than replaced. Clothing was worn until it could no longer be mended. There was little room for waste, and almost no room for long-term planning beyond the immediate future. Despite these challenges, the rhythm of daily life was steady. Children walked to nearby schools, often passing buildings that showed signs of neglect. Cracked pavement, faded paint, and broken fixtures were common sights. City services reached these areas inconsistently, and maintenance was often delayed. Residents learned to live with these conditions, adapting rather than expecting improvement. Complaints rarely led to change, so energy was saved for more immediate concerns. Inside the homes, life was simple and repetitive. Radios played quietly in the background. Televisions, when present, were shared by the household. Meals were basic and familiar, prepared with what was affordable and available. Conversations were practical, centered on schedules, bills, and daily responsibilities. There was little space for dramatics. Life did not move quickly, but it did not stop either. It continued in a slow, unremarkable flow. The sense of invisibility shaped how residents viewed the city around them. The Strip felt distant, even when it was physically close. Its lights could sometimes be seen from certain streets, glowing faintly in the distance, but they belonged to another world. Tourists passed nearby without noticing the neighborhoods they drove through. The city's reputation grew, while these areas remained unchanged. For many residents, this separation became normal. The idea that Las Vegas was a place of excitement existed, but it was not part of their daily experience. Social life within the slums was quiet and informal. Neighbors recognized one another, exchanged brief conversations, and occasionally shared small favors. Borrowing tools, watching a child for a short time, or offering leftover food were common gestures. These interactions were not dramatic acts of community building but simple responses to shared circumstances. Trust developed slowly, based on consistency rather than closeness. People learned who was reliable and who preferred to keep to themselves. Noise was part of the environment, but not the kind associated with entertainment. The sounds of traffic, distant construction, and everyday activity filled the air. At night, the neighborhoods settled into a subdued calm. Streetlights illuminated patches of pavement, and windows glowed softly. The city never fully slept, but these areas rested when they could. The constant energy of the Strip felt far away, even as it continued uninterrupted. For many residents, the future was uncertain but not actively feared. Expectations were modest. Survival, stability, and routine mattered more than ambition. Dreams, when they existed, were quiet and practical. A better job, a safer home, or a slightly easier schedule were considered meaningful improvements. Large changes felt unlikely, so attention remained focused on the present. This everyday existence rarely attracted attention from outsiders. Media coverage of Las Vegas focused on growth, entertainment, and excess. The slum neighborhoods did not fit the narrative. They were neither shocking nor exciting enough to become stories. As a result, they remained absent from the broader historical memory of the city. Yet they were home to thousands of people whose lives continued steadily through the decade. Looking back, it becomes clear that the slums of 1970s Las Vegas were not defined by dramatic moments, but by continuity. Days followed one another with little variation. Work, rest, and routine shaped the passage of time. The city's image moved forward, evolving and expanding, while these neighborhoods remained largely the same. Their presence served as a quiet reminder that beneath the surface of spectacle, ordinary life continued. Understanding this side of Las Vegas does not require excitement or tension. It simply requires attention. These neighborhoods existed alongside fame and fortune, yet followed their own slower rhythm. In the shadow of neon lights, people lived lives that were neither glamorous nor tragic, but steady and real. And it is in this quiet, overlooked reality that the true texture of everyday life in 1970s Las Vegas slums can be found. From a distance measured in minutes rather than miles, the slum neighborhoods of 1970s Las Vegas existed in close physical proximity to the heart of the city's entertainment industry. A short drive could carry someone from polished hotel entrances and carefully landscaped sidewalks into streets where maintenance was inconsistent and time seemed to move more slowly. This closeness made the contrast more noticeable, yet it did not create connection. Instead, it highlighted separation. The casinos and resorts operated as self-contained environments, while nearby residential areas functioned with far fewer resources and little attention from the city's planning priorities. The built environment told this story clearly. Many buildings in these neighborhoods were already decades old by the 1970s. Apartments, small houses, and trailers showed signs of long-term wear. Paint peeled under the desert sun. Roofs were patched rather than replaced. Windows were repaired with simple solutions meant to extend their usefulness rather than restore their appearance. These were not sudden signs of decline, but the result of years without consistent investment. Repairs happened when absolutely necessary, often done by residents themselves with limited materials. Streets reflected a similar pattern. Sidewalks were cracked or uneven, making walking an exercise in attention. Potholes remained for long periods, becoming familiar landmarks rather than problems to be solved. Street lighting was uneven, leaving some areas dim after sunset. City services did reach these neighborhoods, but they arrived slowly and irregularly. Maintenance schedules favored areas tied more directly to tourism and commerce. Residential streets away from public view waited their turn, often without clear timelines. This physical environment shaped how residents experienced space and movement. Traveling to work on the Strip might take only a few minutes, but it felt like crossing an invisible boundary. The visual shift was immediate. Bright lights, clean entrances, and controlled interiors replaced faded walls and open lots. For workers, this transition became a daily routine. They stepped into spaces designed to impress, then returned home to environments shaped by practicality rather than image. Over time, this contrast became normal, though never entirely invisible. Public transportation routes reinforced this separation. Buses connected residential areas to commercial zones, but schedules were limited and stops were basic. Waiting areas offered little protection from heat or wind. For those without cars, daily travel required patience and careful planning. Delays were expected rather than surprising. The city moved at different speeds depending on location, and residents of these neighborhoods adjusted accordingly. City planning decisions in earlier decades continued to affect life in the 1970s. Zoning policies placed low-income housing near industrial or less desirable areas. As the entertainment district expanded, resources followed profit rather than population. This did not happen overnight, and it was rarely discussed openly. Instead, it unfolded gradually, creating a city with sharp contrasts existing side by side. The slums were not hidden behind walls or distance, but behind focus. What the city chose to maintain revealed what it chose to value. Access to public spaces reflected this imbalance. Parks, libraries, and community centers were limited or under-resourced in these neighborhoods. Open areas existed, but they were often undeveloped, offering little beyond open ground and minimal equipment. Residents learned to use what was available, adapting spaces for informal gatherings or quiet rest. Expectations were modest. A shaded area, a bench, or a clear patch of ground was enough. The proximity to casinos also shaped sound and atmosphere. On certain nights, distant noise from traffic and entertainment carried across neighborhoods, especially when the air was still. The glow of lights sometimes reflected faintly against the night sky, visible from streets that otherwise remained dim. These reminders of nearby wealth and activity were present but muted, like echoes from another place. They did not invite participation. They simply existed in the background. For many residents, this closeness created a complicated relationship with the city's image. Las Vegas was known worldwide as a place of excitement, yet their daily surroundings did not reflect that reputation. The city's identity felt external, belonging to visitors rather than inhabitants. This disconnect influenced how people thought about where they lived. Pride in the city was often abstract, tied to employment rather than environment. Home was defined by familiarity, not appearance. Local businesses in these neighborhoods operated on small margins. Corner stores, laundromats, and repair shops served immediate needs. Their buildings were simple, their interiors practical. These businesses did not change often, and when they did, it was noticeable. A new sign or repaired doorway stood out. Stability mattered more than growth. The goal was to remain open, not to expand. Emergency services reached these areas, but response times varied. Residents understood that help might not arrive quickly, so self-reliance became important. Small issues were handled locally whenever possible. This did not come from mistrust alone, but from experience. People learned which problems required official attention and which could be managed quietly. Over time, this shaped a culture of low expectations and careful decision-making. Despite the limitations, these neighborhoods were not frozen in time. Life continued, adapted, and adjusted. People moved in and out as jobs changed. Buildings shifted purpose, becoming homes, shops, or storage spaces as needed. The environment was flexible, shaped by use rather than design. This adaptability allowed residents to function within constraints, even as the broader city grew around them. The closeness to the Strip also meant exposure to its economic cycles. When tourism slowed, jobs became less stable. When it increased, work hours expanded, often without corresponding improvements in living conditions. The benefits of growth rarely traveled far from their source. Residents felt the effects indirectly, through schedules and paychecks, rather than through infrastructure or services. In this way, the slum neighborhoods of 1970s Las Vegas existed in a quiet tension with their surroundings. They were near the center of attention, yet outside its focus. The distance between them and the casinos was short, but the difference in experience was vast. This separation shaped daily life, influencing how people moved, worked, and understood their place in the city. It was a world defined not by isolation, but by being overlooked, continuing steadily beside a version of Las Vegas that most people came to see. Housing in the slum neighborhoods of 1970s Las Vegas was defined by limitation, rather than design. These were not places built with comfort or long-term stability in mind. Instead, they were spaces adapted to meet immediate needs, shaped by affordability and availability. Many residences were small apartments originally intended for fewer occupants, modest single-story houses built decades earlier, or trailers placed wherever land could be found. Over time, as rents rose and options narrowed, more people moved into each space, creating crowded living arrangements that became normal rather than exceptional. A typical home might contain far more people than it was designed to hold. Extended families often lived together, with grandparents, parents, and children sharing the same rooms. In other cases, unrelated adults shared housing to divide costs. Bedrooms were multi-purpose spaces, used for sleeping at night and daily activities during the day. Living rooms sometimes became sleeping areas, with mattresses or fold-out furniture arranged and put away as needed. Privacy was limited, and personal space was a rare luxury. These living conditions influenced daily routines in subtle but persistent ways. Mornings required coordination. People woke at different times depending on work schedules, often moving quietly to avoid disturbing others. Bathrooms were shared by many, making time management essential. Kitchens were small and heavily used, with meals prepared in stages rather than all at once. The flow of daily life depended on cooperation, even when communication was minimal. The physical condition of these homes reflected years of use and limited maintenance. Walls showed wear from repeated repairs. Floors creaked or sagged slightly, familiar sounds that residents learned to ignore. Insulation was often poor, making summers especially uncomfortable. Air conditioning, if present, was unreliable or limited to certain rooms. Many relied on fans, open windows, or simply endurance to manage the heat. Winters were milder but still uncomfortable, especially in structures not built to retain warmth. Trailers were a common form of housing in some areas, offering a lower-cost alternative to apartments. These units provided basic shelter but little else. Space was extremely limited, and aging materials required constant attention. Leaks, electrical issues, and plumbing problems were frequent. Repairs were handled informally whenever possible, using available tools and shared knowledge. Professional services were costly and often avoided unless absolutely necessary. Ownership and rental arrangements were often unclear or informal. Some residents rented from small landlords who owned multiple properties but invested minimally in upkeep. Others lived in housing passed down through family or occupied spaces with flexible agreements. Written contracts were not always present, and terms could change quickly. This uncertainty added to a sense of impermanence, even for those who stayed in the same place for years. Furniture and household items were chosen for function rather than appearance. Items were reused, repaired, or acquired secondhand. Matching sets were uncommon. Each piece told a quiet story of adaptation. Tables doubled as workspaces. Chairs were moved frequently to accommodate changing needs. Storage was improvised, using boxes, shelves, or stacked containers. Nothing was wasted if it could still serve a purpose. Noise was a constant presence in crowded homes. Conversations overlapped. Radios or televisions played softly in the background. Footsteps, doors, and daily activity created a steady layer of sound. Silence was rare and usually brief. Residents learned to rest amid noise, tuning it out rather than expecting it to stop. Sleep happened when possible, shaped by exhaustion rather than ideal conditions. Children growing up in these environments learned early how to share space. Play happened wherever room could be found, often outdoors or in communal areas. Inside the home, movement was careful, guided by unspoken rules. Adults balanced authority with necessity, enforcing structure where possible but allowing flexibility where needed. Life required constant adjustment, and routines evolved naturally over time. Despite the crowding, these homes were not defined solely by discomfort. They were places of familiarity and continuity. Objects remained in the same locations year after year. Small habits repeated daily created a sense of order within constraint. Even limited spaces developed rhythms that residents depended on. Knowing where things were, when certain areas would be free, and how to move through the home efficiently provided a quiet form of stability. Maintenance was ongoing but uneven. Small problems accumulated gradually. A loose fixture, a damaged door, or a failing appliance might remain unresolved for long periods. Repairs were prioritized based on urgency rather than completeness. If something still worked, even imperfectly, it was often left alone. This approach was not neglect but necessity, shaped by time, cost, and limited alternatives. The crowded nature of housing also influenced social relationships. Conflicts existed, but they were often managed quietly. There was little space for prolonged disagreement. Cooperation became practical rather than emotional. People learned to tolerate differences, avoid unnecessary tension, and focus on shared needs. Over time, this created a culture of quiet endurance rather than open expression. Moving out or upgrading housing was difficult. Savings accumulated slowly, if at all. Opportunities were unpredictable. Many residents stayed in the same conditions for years, not because they wanted to, but because alternatives were out of reach. The idea of a larger or more comfortable home existed, but it felt distant and uncertain. For most, stability mattered more than improvement. In these slum neighborhoods, housing was less about comfort and more about function. It provided shelter, continuity, and a place to return to after long work hours. Crowded and worn, these homes reflected the broader realities of life in 1970s Las Vegas outside the spotlight. They were not temporary stops for many residents, but long-term environments shaped by necessity, adaptation, and quiet persistence. Employment in the slum neighborhoods of 1970s Las Vegas was closely tied to the city's main economic engine, even though most residents experienced it from the least visible positions. Casinos, hotels, and resorts required an enormous workforce to function smoothly, and much of that labor came from nearby low-income areas. While visitors interacted with dealers, entertainers, and front desk staff, a far larger group worked behind the scenes, keeping the city running without recognition. These jobs were essential but rarely secure. Housekeeping, dishwashing, laundry, maintenance, and basic service roles formed the backbone of daily operations. Workers cleaned rooms that would soon be occupied by new guests, prepared food they would never taste, and maintained spaces designed for others' comfort. Shifts were long and repetitive, often physically demanding, and pay remained modest. Employment contracts, when they existed, offered little protection against sudden schedule changes or layoffs. Work hours rarely followed a standard pattern. Casinos operated around the clock, which meant employees did as well. Some residents worked overnight shifts, returning home as the sun rose. Others began work in the early afternoon and finished late at night. Sleep schedules were fragmented, shaped more by necessity than by routine. Families learned to function with members awake at different times, crossing paths briefly between shifts. Transportation to work was another quiet challenge. While the strip was close, reaching it still required time and planning. Those without cars relied on buses or shared rides. Delays were common, and arriving late could have consequences. Being dependable mattered more than being noticed. Workers aimed to blend into the system, knowing that many others were ready to replace them if they failed to show up. Inside the casinos, the contrast between environments was clear. Back-of-house areas were functional and plain, designed for efficiency rather than appearance. Narrow hallways, storage rooms, and service elevators formed a hidden network beneath the polished floors. Workers moved through these spaces quickly, following routines learned through repetition. Conversations were brief, often limited to instructions or simple exchanges. The focus remained on completing tasks and moving on to the next one. Job stability depended heavily on tourism trends. When business was strong, hours increased, sometimes without notice. When visitor numbers dropped, shifts were cut or eliminated. This unpredictability made financial planning difficult. Income fluctuated, and residents adjusted their spending accordingly. Saving money was challenging, and many lived paycheck to paycheck, aware that a single slow period could disrupt everything. Opportunities for advancement existed but were limited. Moving from a back-of-house role to a more visible position required time, connections, and often additional training. For many residents, these barriers felt out of reach. Language differences, limited education, and rigid hiring practices slowed progress. As a result, people often stayed in the same roles for years, mastering their tasks without expecting significant change. The physical toll of this work accumulated gradually. Cleaning rooms, standing for long hours, lifting heavy items, and repeating the same movements day after day affected bodies over time. Breaks were short and carefully timed. Rest happened at home, when possible, though crowded living conditions made true relaxation difficult. Fatigue became a familiar presence, managed rather than eliminated. Despite these challenges, work provided structure. Shifts created a sense of order in otherwise uncertain lives. Knowing when to leave, where to go, and what was expected offered stability. Many residents took pride in reliability, even when recognition was minimal. Showing up consistently mattered. It was a way to maintain control within a system that offered few guarantees. Interactions between workers and tourists were limited or indirect. Those in service roles moved quietly, avoiding attention. Their goal was efficiency, not engagement. This invisibility reinforced a sense of separation. While they contributed directly to the city's image, they remained outside it. The glamour of Las Vegas existed alongside their labor, not because of it in their daily experience. Outside of work, conversations often returned to schedules and pay. Which shifts were available, which departments were hiring, and which employers treated workers slightly better were common topics. Information circulated informally, passed between neighbors, relatives, and co-workers. These shared details helped people navigate an unstable job market without formal support. Employment benefits were limited. Health coverage, paid leave, and long-term security were rare. Missing work due to illness or family obligations could mean lost income or lost positions. As a result, many residents continued working even when exhausted. The margin for error was small, and caution shaped decisions. For younger residents, entering the workforce often meant following the same path. Part-time or entry-level roles in hotels and casinos were accessible and familiar. These jobs offered immediate income, even if long-term prospects were unclear. Education competed with necessity, and many chose work simply to support their households. In this way, the casino industry reached far beyond the Strip's visible surface. It shaped daily life in nearby slum neighborhoods through schedules, income patterns, and physical demands. Residents were connected to the city's success, yet remained distant from its rewards. Their labor sustained the image of Las Vegas while their own lives continued quietly in its shadow. For most, work was not a source of excitement or ambition. It was a requirement, a routine, and a means of survival. Days blended together through repeated tasks and shifting hours. The city never stopped, and neither did the need to keep going. In the 1970s slums of Las Vegas, employment was less about opportunity and more about endurance, forming another steady layer in the rhythm of everyday life. Daily life in the slum neighborhoods of 1970s Las Vegas followed a rhythm that was rarely fixed and seldom predictable. Routines existed, but they were flexible by necessity, bending around work schedules that changed frequently and incomes that never felt secure. Time was measured less by calendars or clocks and more by shifts, paydays, and bills due. For many residents, each day was a careful balance between energy, money, and obligation. Mornings did not look the same for everyone. Some residents were just returning home as others were waking up. Night workers arrived quietly, moving through crowded homes without turning on lights, careful not to wake sleeping children or relatives. Those heading out for early shifts prepared quickly, eating simple meals and gathering belongings without much conversation. Silence in the early hours was not a sign of peace, but of coordination. Everyone understood that rest, when it came, had to be protected. Because work hours were irregular, sleep was often fragmented. Rest happened in short stretches, adjusted around changing schedules. Afternoon naps were common, as were early bedtimes or late awakenings depending on the day. Bodies adapted slowly, learning to function without a consistent pattern. Fatigue became familiar, something managed quietly rather than discussed. Complaints did not change schedules, so energy was conserved instead. Meals followed the same flexible logic. Families rarely ate together at a fixed time. Food was prepared when someone had a moment, then saved or reheated later. Simple dishes that could stretch across multiple meals were common. Ingredients were chosen for affordability and durability rather than variety. Shopping trips were planned carefully, often timed with paydays. Lists were short and choices were deliberate. Managing money was a constant, quiet task. Income was modest and unpredictable, making budgeting an ongoing process rather than a monthly plan. Bills were prioritized in a practical order. Rent and utilities came first, followed by food and transportation. Everything else waited. Small purchases were considered carefully. Even minor expenses could disrupt the balance, so caution guided decisions. Paydays brought brief moments of relief. Groceries were restocked, debts were reduced slightly, and necessities were addressed. But this sense of ease was temporary. Money moved quickly, disappearing into obligations almost as soon as it arrived. Saving was difficult, and long-term planning felt uncertain. Many residents focused on the present week rather than the future month. Transportation added another layer to daily planning. Bus schedules influenced when people left home and how long commutes lasted. Missed connections meant late arrivals or lost wages. Those who shared rides coordinated carefully, adjusting personal routines to align with others. These arrangements required trust and flexibility, and they changed often as schedules shifted. Household responsibilities were divided informally. Whoever was home handled tasks that needed attention. Cleaning, repairs, childcare, and errands were shared based on availability rather than fixed roles. This system worked because it had to. Structure existed, but it was loose, adapting to each day's demands. Over time, these arrangements became understood rather than discussed. Children adjusted to these patterns early. They learned to be quiet at unusual hours and independent when adults were working. Homework happened whenever space and time allowed. Bedtimes were flexible, shaped by household activity rather than strict rules. These children grew up aware of schedules and responsibilities, learning to observe and adapt rather than expect consistency. Weekends did not always provide rest. For many, they were simply another part of the work cycle. Shifts continued, sometimes longer or more demanding due to increased tourist activity. Days off were irregular and rarely aligned among family members. When free time did appear, it was often used for errands, repairs, or recovery rather than leisure. Entertainment and relaxation were simple and infrequent. Television, radio, or quiet conversation filled moments between obligations. Outings were rare and planned carefully. The city offered countless attractions, but they were largely inaccessible due to cost and time. Leisure existed in small moments rather than events, found in brief pauses rather than planned experiences. The constant need to manage expenses influenced decision-making in subtle ways. Risks were avoided whenever possible. Changing jobs, moving homes, or making large purchases felt dangerous without financial buffers. Stability, even when limited, was valued. Familiar routines provided a sense of control, however small. Knowing what to expect, even if it was difficult, felt safer than uncertainty. Unexpected expenses caused significant stress. A broken appliance, a medical visit, or a missed shift could disrupt an entire household's balance. Solutions were often improvised. Items were repaired, borrowed, or postponed. Help came from within the community when possible, through small loans or shared resources. These arrangements were informal and based on trust built over time. Despite these pressures, daily life was not chaotic. It was structured by necessity, shaped into patterns that worked within constraints. People learned how to move through their days efficiently, conserving energy and resources. Repetition brought familiarity, and familiarity brought a form of comfort. Even difficult routines became manageable once they were understood. Evenings reflected this careful balance. Some residents prepared for upcoming shifts, while others settled into brief rest. The sounds of the neighborhood softened but never fully disappeared. Lights turned off room by room as people adjusted to overlapping schedules. Conversations were short, focused on practical matters. Tomorrow's plans were tentative, ready to change if needed. The city outside continued at its own pace, bright and active, but daily life within these neighborhoods remained grounded in routine. Residents did not experience Las Vegas as a place of constant motion, but as a backdrop to their own steady efforts. The glamour existed nearby, but daily survival required attention elsewhere. Over time, these routines shaped identity. People saw themselves as workers, providers, and caretakers rather than participants in the city's image. Pride came from reliability and endurance. Getting through each day mattered more than recognition. Success was measured quietly, in bills paid and meals prepared. In the slum neighborhoods of 1970s Las Vegas, daily routines were not defined by excitement or change. They were shaped by long shifts, irregular hours, and the careful management of limited income. Life moved forward one day at a time, guided by necessity and repetition. Within this steady rhythm, residents found ways to continue, adapting quietly as the city around them never stopped. Public infrastructure in the slum neighborhoods of 1970s Las Vegas formed the quiet framework around daily life, influencing how people moved, rested, and planned without drawing much attention to itself. These systems were present, but they were inconsistent, aging, and often stretched beyond their limits. Roads, utilities, and public spaces existed in a state of partial function, working well enough to be used but rarely well enough to be trusted. Sidewalks were a common example of this condition. Many were cracked or uneven, shaped by years of heat, shifting ground, and delayed repairs. Walking required attention, especially for children and older residents. People learned which sections to avoid and which routes felt safest. Over time, these broken paths became familiar, no longer noticed as problems but accepted as part of the environment. The idea that sidewalks should be smooth or regularly repaired felt distant and theoretical. Streets showed similar wear. Potholes formed and remained, slowly growing larger as cars passed over them day after day. Repairs came infrequently, often after long delays. Residents adjusted their driving habits accordingly, steering around known problem areas and slowing down in certain stretches. These habits were shared informally, passed along through experience rather than instruction. The streets became a kind of shared map, understood by those who used them regularly. Street lighting was uneven and unreliable. Some areas were well lit, while others remained dim after sunset. Burned-out lights could stay dark for long periods, leaving corners and stretches of road poorly illuminated. At night, residents relied on familiarity rather than visibility. They recognized shapes, sounds, and patterns rather than clearly seeing their surroundings. Darkness was not necessarily threatening, but it demanded awareness. Utilities played a major role in shaping comfort. Electricity was available, but outages were not uncommon. Power disruptions could be brief or extended, and residents learned to prepare for them without formal notice. Flashlights, candles, and battery-powered radios were kept nearby. These interruptions were inconvenient but expected. Complaints rarely resulted in immediate solutions, so adaptation became the default response. Water access was generally reliable, but plumbing issues within older buildings were frequent. Low water pressure, leaks, and occasional service interruptions were part of everyday life. Repairs inside homes depended on cost and urgency. A problem that could be managed temporarily might remain unresolved for months. Residents learned how to live around these limitations, adjusting routines and expectations. Heating and cooling systems were another source of inconsistency. Many homes lacked central systems, relying instead on window units, portable heaters, or fans. During the hottest months, electricity use increased, placing additional strain on aging systems. Cooling a crowded space was difficult, and comfort varied from room to room. People gathered where air moved most freely, shifting locations throughout the day to manage the heat. Trash collection and sanitation services operated on regular schedules, but overflow and delays were common in crowded areas. Containers filled quickly, especially in multi-family dwellings. When pickups were missed or delayed, residents improvised, storing waste wherever possible until service resumed. Cleanliness was maintained as best as circumstances allowed, though conditions were far from ideal. Public maintenance crews were rarely seen. When they did appear, their presence was noticeable precisely because it was unusual. Repairs happened in response to urgent issues rather than preventive care. This reactive approach meant that small problems accumulated over time. A loose fixture, a damaged curb, or a broken sign remained in place until it became unavoidable. Public transportation infrastructure reflected similar priorities. Bus stops were simple, often marked only by signs. Shelters, when present, offered limited protection from sun or wind. Waiting for transportation required patience, especially during extreme weather. Schedules were followed loosely, and delays were accepted as part of the system. Riders adjusted their plans accordingly, building extra time into their routines. Parks and public spaces existed but were minimally developed. Open areas might contain little more than bare ground and a few benches. Equipment, if present, was basic and often worn. These spaces were used quietly, without expectations of improvement. Children played where they could, adapting games to available surroundings. Adults used these areas for brief rest rather than recreation. The condition of infrastructure influenced how residents interacted with their environment. Movement was cautious. Planning accounted for potential disruptions. Trust in systems was limited, replaced by reliance on experience and habit. People learned how to function when things worked imperfectly, which was most of the time. Emergency repairs, when needed, were handled with urgency but little follow-up. A broken line might be fixed temporarily, leaving visible signs of repair behind. These marks accumulated, telling a quiet story of ongoing maintenance without renewal. The environment carried evidence of past fixes rather than signs of long-term care. Despite these limitations, life continued steadily. Infrastructure did not collapse, but it did not improve significantly either. It existed in a state of balance, supporting daily life just enough to allow it to continue. Residents did not expect efficiency or comfort from public systems. They expected function, even if that function was imperfect. This relationship with infrastructure shaped attitudes toward the city. Expectations were low, and reliance on official systems was cautious. When something worked, it was appreciated quietly. When it failed, people adapted. Complaints were rare, not because problems did not exist, but because outcomes were uncertain. Energy was better spent adjusting than waiting. Over time, this environment influenced how residents thought about stability. Comfort was temporary and conditional. Planning focused on what could be controlled rather than what should have been provided. Familiarity replaced optimism. Knowing how to manage a system mattered more than hoping it would improve. The contrast between these neighborhoods and nearby commercial areas remained sharp. While the Strip displayed constant renewal, repairs, and upgrades, residential infrastructure changed slowly. This difference reinforced a sense of separation, not through distance but through experience. Residents moved daily between spaces maintained for appearance and spaces maintained only enough to function. In the slum, neighborhoods of 1970s Las Vegas, public infrastructure quietly shaped every routine. Broken sidewalks, unreliable utilities, and minimal maintenance were not dramatic features, but constant ones. They influenced movement, comfort, and planning without drawing attention. Life continued within these constraints, guided by adaptation and familiarity, forming another steady layer of everyday existence beyond the city's lights. In the slum neighborhoods of 1970s Las Vegas, healthcare and social services existed, but they were not easily reached or consistently available. For many residents, these systems felt distant, shaped by paperwork, long waits, and costs that were difficult to manage. Illness, injury, and personal hardship were handled cautiously, often privately, with an emphasis on endurance rather than intervention. Care, when it came, was usually delayed, informal, or partial. Medical facilities were concentrated in other parts of the city, requiring transportation and time that many residents could not easily spare. Clinics and hospitals operated on schedules that did not align well with irregular work hours. Taking time off for an appointment often meant lost wages, and that loss could ripple through an entire household's finances. As a result, many people postponed care, hoping problems would resolve on their own. Minor illnesses were treated at home whenever possible. Rest, simple remedies, and patience were the first responses. Families relied on experience rather than professional guidance, recognizing familiar symptoms and responding with what they had. Over-the-counter medicine was used sparingly, chosen carefully due to cost. A headache, a fever, or persistent fatigue was managed quietly, folded into daily routine rather than addressed directly. For more serious issues, decisions were difficult. Seeking medical attention meant navigating unfamiliar systems, filling out forms, and waiting in crowded spaces. Language barriers and limited health literacy added to the challenge. Some residents felt uncomfortable or uncertain in clinical settings, unsure what to ask or what services were available to them. This uncertainty discouraged frequent visits and encouraged caution. Emergency care was accessed when absolutely necessary, but it carried its own concerns. The fear of cost lingered even in urgent situations. Bills arriving weeks later could create long-term financial strain. Because of this, emergencies were defined narrowly. Only clear, immediate danger justified the risk. Everything else was managed at home for as long as possible. Preventive care was rare. Regular checkups, screenings, and ongoing treatment were not common parts of life. Health was understood in practical terms. If someone could work and manage daily responsibilities, they were considered well enough. Long-term conditions were endured rather than treated comprehensively. Pain became a background presence, acknowledged but rarely discussed. Social services followed similar patterns. Assistance programs existed, but accessing them required time, documentation, and persistence. Applications moved slowly and outcomes were uncertain. For residents already managing long work hours and crowded households, navigating these systems felt overwhelming. Many chose not to engage at all, relying instead on personal networks and informal arrangements. Within neighborhoods, quiet support systems developed. Neighbors shared information about clinics that were affordable or doctors who were willing to be flexible. Advice circulated through conversation rather than official channels. Someone might recommend a particular place or suggest waiting until a certain day when lines were shorter. This shared knowledge helped people navigate limited options more effectively. Family played a central role in care. Relatives looked after one another during illness, adjusting schedules to provide support. Childcare was shared when parents were unwell. Meals were prepared and delivered without much discussion. These actions were practical responses to necessity rather than expressions of sentiment. Helping was understood as part of daily life. Older residents relied heavily on these informal networks. Mobility challenges and chronic conditions were managed within the home. Medical visits were spaced far apart, sometimes years apart, unless symptoms became severe. Knowledge accumulated slowly, passed from one generation to the next. People learned what worked through experience rather than instruction. Mental and emotional strain was rarely addressed directly. Stress, exhaustion, and anxiety were treated as normal parts of life. There were few spaces for discussion or relief. Rest, when it came, was physical rather than emotional. Quiet moments, short breaks, and familiar routines provided limited comfort. Problems were absorbed into daily life rather than named. Schools and community organizations sometimes served as informal points of contact for assistance. Teachers noticed when children were unwell or struggling and offered what support they could. Churches and small community groups provided occasional help, though resources were limited. These institutions filled gaps where formal systems did not reach, operating quietly and without recognition. The lack of consistent services influenced how residents thought about vulnerability. Self-reliance was valued not as an ideal, but as a requirement. Depending on systems that might fail felt risky. People learned to manage expectations, focusing on what could be handled internally. Asking for help was done cautiously, often only after other options were exhausted. This approach shaped long-term outcomes. Conditions that might have been manageable with early care became chronic. Small injuries lingered. Fatigue accumulated. Yet life continued. People adapted, adjusting their pace and expectations. Health became another variable to manage, like income or scheduling, rather than a separate priority. The contrast with the city's image was striking. While Las Vegas promoted comfort, luxury, and constant availability, nearby neighborhoods lived with scarcity and delay. Access existed in theory, but not in practice. The systems designed to support well-being felt distant from daily reality. Residents learned to live with this distance, integrating it into their understanding of the city. Despite limitations, there was resilience in these quiet networks. People looked after one another in practical ways, sharing time and knowledge. Care was not formal or comprehensive, but it was present. It moved through relationships rather than institutions, shaped by familiarity and trust. Over time, these patterns became part of neighborhood identity. Health and support were communal concerns, handled collectively when possible. The absence of reliable services did not stop life, but it did shape how it was lived. Expectations were modest, and solutions were temporary. In the slum neighborhoods of 1970s Las Vegas, access to healthcare and social services was limited, uneven, and often difficult to navigate. Residents responded not with protest, but with adaptation. They relied on one another, managed quietly, and endured. Care happened in small, practical ways, woven into daily routine, forming another steady layer of life beyond the city's lights. Education in the slum neighborhoods of 1970s Las Vegas existed within the same constraints that shaped housing, work, and infrastructure. Schools were present, but they operated with limited resources and heavy demands. Classrooms were crowded, supplies were basic, and buildings often showed the same signs of age and neglect seen throughout the neighborhood. For many children, school was less a place of inspiration and more a continuation of daily routine. School buildings were functional but worn, paint faded under constant sun. Hallways echoed with movement as large numbers of students passed through narrow spaces. Repairs were made when necessary, but improvements were rare. Heating and cooling systems were inconsistent, making classrooms uncomfortable during extreme weather. Students adapted, learning to focus amid distraction rather than expecting ideal conditions. Class sizes were large, and teachers managed heavy workloads. Individual attention was difficult to provide, not because of lack of care, but because of limited time and support. Lessons moved at a steady pace, designed to keep order rather than explore depth. Teachers focused on maintaining structure, ensuring that each day progressed without disruption. Stability mattered more than innovation. Many students came from households shaped by irregular work schedules. Parents worked nights, early mornings, or multiple jobs, leaving limited time for involvement in school life. Homework was completed when possible, often without guidance. Quiet spaces for study were rare in crowded homes. Children learned to work around noise and interruptions, developing independence early out of necessity. Attendance fluctuated. Family responsibilities, transportation issues, and health concerns affected consistency. Some students missed days to help at home or because getting to school became complicated. These absences were often unremarkable, treated as part of life rather than exceptions. Schools adjusted expectations accordingly, focusing on basic continuity rather than strict standards. Resources such as books, equipment, and extracurricular programs were limited. Libraries were small, and materials were shared across classes. Art, music, and enrichment activities existed but were modest. Opportunities depended on funding that was never guaranteed. When programs were offered, participation was high, reflecting a quiet desire for engagement beyond routine. Teachers played multiple roles. Beyond instruction, they observed changes in behavior, signs of fatigue, or difficulty at home. Support was offered informally through encouragement and flexibility rather than formal intervention. These efforts mattered, but they could not address larger structural challenges. Schools did what they could within their constraints. For many students, school provided predictability. The schedule, rules, and repetition offered a sense of order that contrasted with shifting routines at home. Even when resources were limited, the structure itself had value. Knowing where to be and what was expected created stability, even if long-term outcomes were uncertain. Academic expectations were often practical rather than aspirational. Education was seen as useful, but not necessarily transformative. Many students anticipated entering the workforce early, following familiar paths into service or labor roles. College felt distant and abstract, discussed rarely and pursued by few. Guidance counseling existed, but options felt limited by circumstance. Transitions between grades were steady but uneventful. Progression mattered more than achievement. Students moved forward as part of the system, advancing year by year. Those who struggled were rarely singled out, and those who excelled often did so quietly. Recognition was modest, reflecting the broader culture of understatement. Peer relationships formed naturally within this environment. Friendships developed through shared experience rather than shared ambition. Children understood one another's circumstances without explanation. Differences in background mattered less than familiarity. School was a place where many felt understood, even if opportunities were limited. Discipline focused on order. Maintaining calm in crowded classrooms required clear rules and consistent enforcement. Expectations were communicated simply. The goal was to keep learning moving forward without disruption. This approach created a predictable environment, though it left little room for flexibility or individual expression. As students grew older, the connection between school and work became more visible. Part-time jobs were common, and responsibilities increased. Education competed with income and family needs. Decisions about staying in school were influenced by immediate necessity rather than long-term planning. Many students balanced both as long as they could. Despite limitations, schools were not without value. They provided routine, social connection, and a shared experience that shaped childhood memories. Teachers, students, and staff formed communities within constraint. Progress happened quietly, measured in small achievements rather than dramatic change. The broader city's image rarely intersected with these classrooms. While Las Vegas expanded and transformed, schools in slum neighborhoods changed slowly. Their challenges remained consistent, shaped by funding priorities and population growth. Education reflected the same pattern seen elsewhere: proximity to wealth without access to its benefits. In the slum neighborhoods of 1970s Las Vegas, schools functioned as steady, imperfect institutions. Underfunded and overcrowded, they focused on continuity rather than promise. For children growing up in these areas, education was part of daily life, offering structure and familiarity, even as opportunities beyond it remained uncertain. In the slum neighborhoods of 1970s Las Vegas, crime was a reality, but it was not the central feature of everyday life. It existed in the background, acknowledged but rarely dramatized by those who lived there. Residents were aware of risks, yet their attention was focused elsewhere. Work schedules, household responsibilities, and financial management occupied far more mental space than fear. Life required steady effort, leaving little room for constant anxiety. Most incidents were minor and familiar. Property-related issues, small disputes, and occasional disturbances were part of the environment, but they were not daily crises. People learned which areas to avoid at certain times and which situations required caution. This knowledge developed gradually through experience rather than instruction. Awareness became routine, integrated into daily movement rather than treated as an emergency. Neighborhoods developed their own unspoken rules. Residents understood which streets were quieter and which drew more activity. They recognized patterns in noise and movement, distinguishing between ordinary disruption and situations that required attention. This familiarity reduced uncertainty. Knowing what was typical made it easier to remain calm when something unusual occurred. Interactions with law enforcement were limited and cautious. Police presence was visible at times but not constant. Responses varied, and trust was uneven. Many residents preferred to handle small issues within the community rather than involve outside authorities. This approach was shaped by experience and practicality rather than ideology. Engaging official systems took time and offered uncertain outcomes. Most people adjusted their routines to reduce risk. Doors were locked, windows secured, and personal belongings kept close. These habits were not driven by fear, but by practicality. Taking simple precautions became part of daily life, no different from managing schedules or budgets. Over time, these actions felt ordinary rather than protective. At night, the neighborhoods grew quieter. Movement slowed, and activity became more predictable. Residents who worked late returned home quickly, following familiar routes. Street lighting, where available, guided movement, but familiarity mattered more. The darkness did not necessarily signal danger, but it required awareness. People trusted their knowledge of the environment. Children were taught basic rules early, staying close to home, being aware of surroundings, and returning at certain times were understood expectations. These lessons were communicated calmly, without alarm. Safety was framed as responsibility rather than fear. Children learned through observation as much as instruction, absorbing patterns from daily life. Community presence played a role in maintaining balance. Neighbors noticed changes, unfamiliar activity, or disruptions to routine. Information traveled quietly through conversation. This awareness created a sense of informal oversight, even without formal organization. People looked out for one another in practical ways, intervening subtly when needed. Serious incidents did occur, but they were remembered as exceptions rather than norms. Stories circulated, often without detail, serving as reminders rather than warnings. These moments reinforced caution but did not dominate daily thinking. Life continued, shaped by necessity rather than anticipation of danger. The proximity to the Strip influenced perceptions of crime. Tourist areas received more attention and resources, while residential neighborhoods operated with fewer visible measures. Residents understood this imbalance and adjusted expectations accordingly. They relied more on personal awareness than on external protection. Despite economic strain and environmental challenges, most residents did not define their neighborhoods by crime. They defined them by familiarity. The streets, buildings, and routines were known quantities. Knowing what to expect reduced fear. Uncertainty, more than crime itself, was what people sought to avoid. Daily survival required focus. Getting to work on time, managing expenses, and maintaining household stability demanded attention and energy. These priorities left little room for constant worry. Concern existed, but it was managed, not amplified. Fear did not serve a practical purpose, so it was kept in check. Media portrayals of urban areas often emphasized danger and disorder, but these images did not match lived experience. Residents experienced continuity rather than chaos. Most days passed without incident, marked by routine rather than disruption. This normalcy was rarely acknowledged but deeply felt. Evenings were shaped by this understanding. People settled in, prepared for the next day, and rested when possible. Noise levels dropped, and activity slowed. The environment became quieter, more predictable. This rhythm reinforced a sense of control, however limited. Trust developed not through institutions, but through consistency. Seeing the same people, following the same paths, and observing familiar patterns created stability. Crime, while present, did not erase this familiarity. It was one factor among many, not the defining one. In the slum neighborhoods of 1970s Las Vegas, crime existed as part of the environment, but it did not dominate daily life. Residents were practical, attentive, and focused on survival rather than fear. Routine, familiarity, and steady effort shaped their experience far more than moments of danger, forming another quiet layer of everyday existence beyond the city's lights. In the slum neighborhoods of 1970s Las Vegas, community did not emerge from organized programs or official planning. It formed slowly, through repetition, proximity, and shared circumstances. People lived close together, often closer than they might have chosen. And over time this closeness created familiarity. Faces became recognizable, routines predictable, and small interactions accumulated into something steadier. Community was not announced or celebrated. It simply existed, quietly, as part of daily life. Neighbors learned about one another through observation more than conversation. They noticed who left early for work, who returned late, which households had children, and which elders stayed indoors during the heat. This awareness required no formal introduction. It developed naturally, shaped by shared space and repeated exposure. Over time, these observations created a sense of mutual understanding. Sharing resources was common, though rarely discussed openly. A borrowed tool, a spare chair, a small amount of food, or access to a phone were exchanged without ceremony. These acts were practical responses to limited means rather than expressions of generosity in a traditional sense. People helped because it made daily life easier for everyone. The expectation was not repayment, but balance over time. Information moved through casual conversation. News about job openings, schedule changes, or nearby services spread from doorway to doorway. Warnings about utility outages, construction, or disruptions traveled quickly. This informal communication filled gaps left by limited access to official information. Knowing what was happening nearby reduced uncertainty and helped residents plan their days. Childcare often became a shared responsibility. Adults watched over children who played nearby, even if they were not related. This supervision was informal and unobtrusive. A raised voice, a reminder, or a watchful glance was enough. Children learned which adults were familiar and which spaces were considered safe. This collective awareness created a loose but effective safety net. Elders held a quiet position within these communities. Their presence was steady, their routines consistent. They offered advice when asked and observed more than they spoke. Younger residents respected their familiarity with the neighborhood. Elders often noticed changes first, recognizing when something felt different or out of place. Their awareness added another layer of stability. Daily interactions were brief but meaningful. Greetings were short, conversations practical. Time and energy were limited, so communication focused on what mattered. This efficiency did not indicate distance. It reflected shared understanding. People did not need long explanations. They understood each other's constraints. Mutual aid extended beyond material support. Emotional support appeared in subtle ways. A shared silence, a nod of recognition, or a moment of listening provided reassurance. These gestures acknowledged shared experience without requiring vulnerability. In environments where survival demanded strength, quiet understanding mattered more than words. Cultural diversity shaped these neighborhoods. Residents came from different backgrounds, bringing varied traditions, languages, and habits. Differences were visible, but conflict was limited. Daily necessity encouraged cooperation. Respect was practical rather than ideological. People learned how to coexist because it was required, not because it was promoted. Community gatherings were rare and unstructured. There were no regular meetings or organized events. Interaction happened organically, in hallways, outside doorways, or near shared spaces. These moments did not feel special. They were simply part of the environment. Over time, they created continuity. Trust developed slowly. It was based on consistency rather than promises. Showing up regularly, keeping routines, and respecting boundaries built confidence. People learned who could be relied upon and in what ways. Trust was specific, not generalized. It applied to certain tasks or situations rather than broad assumptions. When difficulties arose, residents often addressed them collectively, though informally. A broken fixture, a shared inconvenience, or a recurring issue prompted quiet cooperation. Solutions were improvised, using available skills and resources. This problem-solving reinforced a sense of shared responsibility. Isolation existed, but it was softened by proximity. Even those who preferred privacy were surrounded by familiar presence. Knowing others were nearby reduced the sense of being alone, even without direct interaction. This passive connection mattered, especially during periods of stress or uncertainty. Over time, these informal communities became part of residents' identity. The neighborhood was not just a place to live, but a network of known people and routines. Leaving meant losing that familiarity. For many, this connection outweighed the physical limitations of the environment. These communities did not eliminate hardship. Poverty, instability, and limited opportunity remained. However, shared experience made these challenges more manageable. Knowing that others faced similar constraints reduced isolation and self-blame. Struggle became a collective condition rather than a personal failure. The contrast with the nearby Strip made this solidarity more pronounced. While the city projected images of excitement and excess, residents relied on restraint and cooperation. Their lives moved at a different pace, guided by necessity rather than spectacle. Community replaced luxury as a source of stability. In the slum neighborhoods of 1970s Las Vegas, informal communities formed not from choice, but from circumstance. Neighbors shared resources, information, and presence, creating quiet solidarity. This network did not solve every problem, but it offered continuity, understanding, and support, forming an essential part of everyday life beyond the city's lights. In 1970s Las Vegas, the distance between wealth and hardship could be measured not in miles, but in minutes. A short drive separated neighborhoods of quiet struggle from corridors of constant light. This closeness made the contrast impossible to ignore. Residents living in the slums were keenly aware of how near they were to abundance, even as it remained out of reach. The city existed in two parallel realities, operating side by side without truly intersecting. The Strip was designed to overwhelm the senses. Lights remained bright through the night, music spilled from open doors, and crowds moved continuously. It presented an image of endless energy and opportunity. For visitors, this environment felt separate from ordinary life, a place meant for escape. For nearby residents, it was simply part of the landscape, visible but distant in meaning. From many slum neighborhoods, the glow of the Strip could be seen on the horizon. At night, it colored the sky faintly, a reminder of activity happening elsewhere. This light did not bring comfort. It emphasized difference. While tourists celebrated, residents prepared for another day of routine. The lights signaled motion, but not progress for those watching from afar. Employment tied the two worlds together in limited ways. Many slum residents worked on the Strip, performing roles that supported its constant operation. They cleaned rooms, maintained equipment, prepared food, and handled logistics. These jobs were essential, yet invisible. Workers entered through service corridors, moved behind scenes, and left before visitors noticed their presence. The wages from these jobs sustained families, but rarely allowed mobility. Income covered rent, utilities, and basic needs, leaving little room for advancement. The wealth generated on the Strip flowed upward, concentrated among owners and investors. For workers, the Strip represented labor rather than luxury. It was a source of income, not opportunity. This imbalance shaped daily perception. Residents understood that the city's image was not built for them. Advertising, entertainment, and public attention focused outward, aimed at attracting visitors. Neighborhoods of poverty remained unmentioned, absent from brochures and promotions. Their existence contradicted the narrative of endless success. Infrastructure reflected these priorities. Streets near the Strip received regular maintenance, lighting, and decoration. Public services were visible and responsive. In contrast, slum neighborhoods experienced delayed repairs, limited upgrades, and minimal investment. This difference reinforced the sense of neglect. Resources followed visibility, not need. The silence of these neighborhoods stood in contrast to the constant noise nearby. Without crowds or spectacle, daily life moved slowly. Sounds were familiar: footsteps, distant traffic, household activity. This quiet was not peaceful by design, but by circumstance. It reflected limited movement and constrained options rather than calm choice. Residents learned to navigate these dual realities. They traveled into the Strip for work, then returned home to different conditions. This transition required adjustment. Expectations changed with location. What was normal in one space felt out of place in the other. This mental shift became routine, practiced daily. The contrast influenced self-perception. Living near wealth without access to it shaped how residents viewed their position. Some felt frustration, others resignation. Most accepted the situation as structural rather than personal. The scale of the difference made individual effort feel insufficient to bridge the gap. Children growing up in these neighborhoods noticed the disparity early. They saw visitors arrive with excitement and leave unchanged by the surrounding environment. They observed adults work long hours without visible reward. These observations shaped understanding of opportunity and limitation, often before formal education addressed such concepts. The city's layout reinforced separation. Physical barriers, zoning decisions, and transportation patterns limited interaction. Visitors rarely entered residential slum areas. Residents rarely visited the Strip for leisure. This separation preserved the illusion of a unified city while maintaining division. Media coverage amplified the imbalance. News and promotion focused on entertainment, expansion, and record-breaking numbers. Stories of everyday life in poor neighborhoods were rare. When mentioned, they lacked depth, reduced to statistics rather than experiences. This absence contributed to invisibility. Despite this, residents developed a grounded perspective. They understood the city beyond its surface. They saw how appearance was maintained and who paid the cost. This awareness was not abstract. It came from daily movement between spaces, from lived contrast rather than analysis. Some residents found a sense of stability in the separation. The Strip's excess felt disconnected from their reality. Their neighborhoods, though limited, were familiar and consistent. The predictability offered a form of control absent in the chaotic energy of tourist areas. Economic inequality was not expressed through dramatic confrontation. It existed quietly, embedded in routine. No single moment defined it. Instead, it appeared in repeated patterns, long commutes, limited services, static wages. These patterns accumulated over time, shaping experience without announcement. The proximity of wealth did not guarantee aspiration. For many, survival took precedence over ambition. The effort required to maintain daily stability left little space for imagining change. The Strip remained a backdrop rather than a goal. This contrast also affected how residents measured success. Stability became a meaningful achievement. Paying bills, maintaining housing, and keeping routines intact represented progress. These goals differed from the city's public image but held equal importance within these communities. The silence of slum neighborhoods carried weight. It was not empty, but full of unspoken awareness. Residents knew what existed nearby and understood why it remained inaccessible. This knowledge did not always produce anger. Often, it resulted in acceptance shaped by realism. In 1970s Las Vegas, economic inequality was not hidden by distance. It was highlighted by proximity. The glittering Strip and the quiet slums coexisted within sight of one another, revealing a city divided by function and attention. For those living beyond the lights, this contrast became part of everyday understanding, shaping how they saw the city and their place within it. For those who lived in the slum neighborhoods of 1970s Las Vegas, life rarely felt like a story worth telling. There were no constant turning points, no clear moments of triumph or collapse. Instead, days blended into one another, shaped by routine and necessity. What defined existence was not intensity, but continuity. Life moved forward slowly, guided by repetition rather than change. Mornings often began the same way. People woke early or late depending on work schedules, prepared simple meals, and left home with little ceremony. There was no sense of anticipation beyond the practical. The goal was not progress, but maintenance. Each day needed to be managed carefully to avoid disruption. Stability, however limited, was valuable. Work dominated much of daily life. Jobs were demanding and often physically tiring. Schedules changed, hours fluctuated, and income remained uncertain. Despite this, People showed up consistently. Reliability became a form of endurance. Continuing to work, even when rewards were minimal, was necessary for survival. There was little expectation that effort would lead to advancement. Work existed to sustain the present, not to build the future. Time outside of work followed predictable patterns. Household tasks filled the hours. Cleaning, repairing, and organizing took place gradually, often spread across days. Resources were limited, so items were reused and maintained carefully. Nothing was wasted without reason. This attention to preservation extended beyond objects to energy itself. People conserved effort, choosing when to act and when to rest. Entertainment was modest and infrequent. Television, radio, or quiet conversation provided distraction. These moments were not framed as leisure in a modern sense. They were pauses rather than escapes. Rest was practical, a way to recover before the next obligation. Pleasure existed, but it was understated and brief. Weekdays and weekends felt similar. Without disposable income or flexible time, distinctions blurred. Days were measured by tasks completed rather than calendar labels. Holidays passed quietly, marked only by small changes in routine. Celebration required resources that were often unavailable. Instead, continuity itself became reassuring. Emotionally, life was steady rather than expressive. There was little space for dramatic highs or lows. People learned to manage feelings privately. Showing too much vulnerability risked disruption. Strength was demonstrated through consistency, not display. Endurance became a quiet skill, practiced daily. Relationships reflected this rhythm. Friendships and family ties were built on presence rather than communication. People did not always articulate care, but they showed it through reliability. Being there mattered more than words. This understated connection suited the environment, where energy was limited and attention divided. Change, when it occurred, was gradual. Neighborhoods shifted slowly as people moved in and out. Buildings aged, repairs accumulated, and conditions evolved without clear milestones. Residents adapted without expectation of improvement. Adjustment became habitual. Life required flexibility, but not optimism. Children growing up in these neighborhoods absorbed this sense of continuity. They learned routines early and understood responsibility as part of daily existence. Dreams were shaped by observation rather than imagination. Expectations aligned with what was visible. While aspiration existed, it was tempered by realism. Memory played a subtle role. Residents remembered past difficulties and measured the present against them. Survival itself became a reference point. If things were not worse, they were acceptable. This perspective reduced disappointment. Improvement was not necessary to feel stable. There was dignity in this persistence, though it was rarely acknowledged. Continuing under constraint required discipline. Maintaining routines in the face of uncertainty demanded resilience. Yet these qualities were not labeled or praised. They were simply practiced quietly and continuously. The absence of drama did not mean absence of meaning. Meaning was found in completion. Finishing a shift, paying rent, preparing a meal, or repairing something broken provided satisfaction. These moments were small, but they accumulated. Life was built from these fragments rather than grand events. External attention rarely reached these neighborhoods. Without recognition, residents did not perform their lives for an audience. There was no pressure to narrate experience. Life unfolded without commentary. This invisibility contributed to the sense of routine. Nothing needed to be explained. Over time, this repetition shaped identity. People understood themselves as capable of endurance. They knew their limits and adjusted accordingly. Expectations narrowed, but stability increased. The predictability offered a sense of control, however constrained. Aging occurred quietly. Years passed without clear markers. Residents noticed time through physical change rather than milestones. Bodies tired, routines slowed, but the structure remained. Life continued without dramatic transformation. This persistence was not resignation. It was adaptation. People did not give up. They adjusted. They found ways to continue without exhausting hope. This balance allowed survival without constant frustration. Endurance became sustainable. The city around them continued to change. The strip expanded, attractions evolved, and the city's image shifted. These changes rarely reached the slums in meaningful ways. Residents observed transformation from a distance, aware but unaffected. Their lives followed a separate rhythm. The gap between image and reality widened, but daily life remained consistent. This consistency insulated residents from disappointment. Expectations were grounded in experience, not promise. What mattered was what could be relied upon. Even hardship became familiar. Challenges repeated often enough to lose their shock. This familiarity reduced fear. When difficulty is expected, it becomes manageable. Preparation replaces reaction. In the end, life in the 1970s Las Vegas slums was defined by quiet persistence. It was not marked by spectacle or crisis, but by continuity. Residents endured not through dramatic resistance, but through routine. Each day resembled the last, and that resemblance provided structure. This ordinary endurance rarely appears in history. It lacks excitement and resolution. Yet it represents how most people lived. Beyond the city's lights and stories, life continued steadily, shaped by repetition, patience, and the quiet determination to carry on. As we step back from these quiet streets and faded buildings, what remains is not a tale of spectacle, but a portrait of ordinary endurance. Life in the 1970s Las Vegas slums unfolded far from headlines and neon signs, shaped by routine, restraint, and familiarity. It was a life lived in repetition, where progress was measured not by ambition, but by stability. Day after day, residents navigated limited resources, uneven attention, and constant contrast with the city's public image. Yet they continued. Their stories were not loud, dramatic, or neatly resolved. They were steady, grounded, and human. In the shadow of a city built on illusion and excitement, these neighborhoods remind us that most history happens quietly, carried forward by people who persist without recognition. Thank you for spending this time with us and for listening to this calm journey into the past. If you found this story comforting or thought-provoking, we are glad you were here. Take a moment to rest, relax, and let the quiet linger. Until next time, take care and good night.